Thank you for coming. You can probably discard the outline I gave you or use it for scratch paper. I have made several changes in the process of thinking through this, and early on I was going this direction, but I have made some modifications, so ignore the sheet and maybe even ignore me today. But we are talking about the polyphony, quotation mark, of hymnody, and of course we're talking about the many voices of hymnody. A truly fine hymn, in my opinion, is interdisciplinary. And some of the disciplines that hymnody is concerned with are disciplines. Some of them are among the most ancient disciplines, and some of them the most influential and important disciplines still today. Craig, this is not, Sean, this is not responding very quickly. What's the matter here? Okay. So we can speak of it as a polyphony, many voices of disciplines. And when we add polyphony, we're adding simultaneity to it, voices at the same time. So a hymn, in my opinion, is simultaneously biblical, theological, liturgical, literary, musical, historical, biographical, socio-cultural, and functional. So those are what I refer to as the voices of a good hymn. However, a hymn is actually a very tiny piece of text and music. And in a sense, I guess you could say hymns are kind of the atomic particles of church music. The Bach scholar Charles Sanford Terry wrote, throughout his life, the Lutheran hymn book unfailingly stimulated Bach's interpretive faculty. Bach was, of course, one of the greatest musicians that ever lived, and probably the greatest church musician that ever lived. I think he harmonized 371 German chorales or hymn tunes of his time. He wrote about 300 cantatas, 5 passions, 3 oratorios, and in every one of those, hymns play an enormous part in those works. It is a tiny piece of text and music. It takes about 34 seconds to sing a stanza of a hymn. It takes about 2.5 minutes to sing all 4 verses of a hymn. That's approximate, but that is a pretty small item to carry as much weight as it does dealing with those 8 voices that I talked to you about. The 4 stanzas are usually in a relative limited number of meters and usually a very limited number of rhyme schemes. Often the music is only about 16 measures, and usually 4 measures of those are repeated twice, or very often they're repeated twice. So it is a small atomic particle of the good term, maybe good, okay. I'm calling on my A&M, do I say that at Baylor? A&M engineering major back there, yeah. So it is kind of the atomic particles of hymnody. And yet, for 1,000 years, for millions of people all across the world, every week, some form of hymns had been part of the most important human activity, Christian worship. And Christian worship is the springboard, I think, of everything else the church does. private, family, public worship is the heart of all we do, I think, as a church. And it's fascinating that for thousands of years, millions of people all over the world, in some form, have been singing hymns. I'm concerned this afternoon with what I call traditional hymnody or gospel song of the 18th to the 21st century. And contemporary praise and worship song we'll save for another time. What I mean by a fine hymn is a hymn that is the polyphony of disciplines, and as I said, does involve those 8 voices. That, to me, is something that's necessary for what I would call a fine hymn. There's a lot of trite hymnody, or in my opinion, trite hymnody, that deals superficially with summary of all of these things. But I have to remember, when I say trite or I say fine, it's not categorical, different things to different people. I remember some years ago as an interim minister of music at University Baptist Church in Fort Worth, we were doing an evening hymn sing, and I had asked people to suggest hymns for our singing, but asked them to be sure to tell us why that hymn was meaningful to them. Miss Carter, bless her heart, suggested a hymn that I could do very well with never singing again. I won't tell you what, but she suggested the hymn, and I thought, Miss Carter, please not that. But she began to tell why it was meaningful to her. By the time she was through, I thought, that's a pretty nice hymn. And it makes a big difference if your association with the hymn. Routley said something of the same thing. He mentioned one time that a hymn he did not particularly like, but he did read that at one point in German history, a group of Nazis had come into a town to take it over, and a group of Christians sang this hymn over and over, that they couldn't even make themselves heard. And so he said that he developed a different appreciation for that hymn. Incidentally, talking about Routley, anybody know Routley as a name? I'm sure some of you do. Yeah. I think he was the foremost hymnologist of his time. Very brilliant man. He spoke at our seminary one day, and I was leading the music for it, and I chose a hymn that he had said was one of his favorite hymns. And I was so proud as we walked back from chapel to the building. He said, I never did like that tune you chaps sing that to. Lose a few, I guess. Okay. So I think of hymns as interdisciplinary, and the larger academic community has, for the last few decades, been moving into the area of interdisciplinary studies. The American professor of science, biologist, naturalist, ecologist, entomologist, and Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard professor of science, Edward O. Wilson, said the natural sciences have begun to shift toward a new kind of synthesis, holism. He went on to say, we're approaching a new age of synthesis when the testing of consilience is the greatest of all intellectual challenges. And by consilience, Wilson was talking about the convergence of evidence from different independent sources to support a strong conclusion. And then Stephen Hawking was seeking a theory of everything, TOE, a complete understanding of the universe. He was trying to explain what it is, why it exists at all, essentially encompassing all the fundamental laws of physics and providing a unified description of the cosmos. And he once described his pursuit of the theory of everything as an approach to trying to understand the mind of God. I leave the theory of everything to Stephen Hawking's followers, but I do advocate a comprehensive and integrated approach to hymnody, an interdisciplinary area. But hymnology, in spite of its inherent interdisciplinary nature, has seemingly remained relatively isolated. It seems that the people who write hymns, select hymns, compose hymns, teach hymnody, have not talked much about the interdisciplinary aspects of hymnody. Very often it seems to be taught historically or biographically, but very, very little attention given to all these other voices or aspects of hymnody. I think there's some obvious reasons for this. For one thing, most of us are not equipped to talk about those 8 areas. I'm certainly not an expert in those 8 areas, but I do have an interest in them and some study of them. But it seems to me that it's an area where a lot of people that are experts in each of these fields seem disinclined to get together and discuss the hymnody. That's what I tried to do in the book Hermeneutics of Hymnody, is to bring attention to that comprehensive and integrated interdisciplinary approach to the hymnody. I think many of us move in a relatively small area of hymnody, and in preparation for this session, I attended in the last few weeks 10 different congregations, trying to understand what is the state of congregational singing. And I was observing worship and hymn singing. I went to 2 Baptist churches different times. I went to a Lutheran church, to a United Methodist church, and I went to a traditional United Methodist church, and another time went to a contemporary service of a Methodist church, a Presbyterian church, an Episcopal church, and here again one Sunday I went to a traditional Episcopal service, and another time to a contemporary, and to a Roman Catholic Mass, and to a conservative Jewish synagogue, trying to understand what's happening in hymnology, at least in that geographical area. It may be something different in Michigan, but you can help us with that in a moment. In addition, I attended 2 mega churches online, one in Houston and one in Dallas. And in addition to that, I went to 2 hymn festivals that were broadcast by the Hymn Society of America. So in the last few weeks, I have tried to look at what's happening at least 14 different congregations in a wide variety of denominations. Argue with me or support me or something. What is your experience with congregations singing at this point? Let me tell you first of all my basic findings, and then you kind of listen to this and then talk to me about if these are cases you know or not. There were hymns, choruses, chants, canticles, all performed in different ways. It was interesting to see a large group of multicultural people coming to worship, and I was pleased with that. That was especially true in the Catholic and the Lutheran Church. I think the Pope and Martin Luther would both have been proud of the congregations that were there those Sundays I was. But it was really inspiring to see. They weren't all singing, but they were involved, and many of them were holding hymnals, and many were singing those congregations. In most churches, they sang 3 hymns, on average. In the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church, they sang 6 long hymns, along with some chants and canticles. That happened in the Lutheran Church as well. The Jewish service was a phenomenal experience for me. It was about as welcoming as I had with anybody. They took me in. One man named Isaac, the Old Testament biblical name, and he just helped me get to a place up front on the side where I can see and hear, and he would lean over and explain something once in a while. but for almost 1 hour solid, the full congregation chanted Hebrew psalms and hymns, almost for an hour. It was an unbelievable experience to sit there, and the rabbi was kind of the cantor that Sunday, and it was an interesting experience to hear almost an hour of chanted Hebrew by congregation. It was really a phenomenal experience, yeah. The Catholic and the Lutheran use hymn boards where they posted the page number for the hymns. In only 2 of the Christian churches was there a leader who conducted congregational singing. Other than that, somebody simply led by voice, or there was no leader at all. Only 2 of the churches projected the scripture or the hymn text. At the United Methodist Church, there was a beautiful sanctuary, and on each side of the pulpit were large walls that were vacant, really a beautiful architecture, and they projected the hymns onto that wall, and it looked like they had been engraved in there. These are these are engraved in stone, and I had never seen anything quite that. Sometimes the apparatus is distracting with all of that, but this was an experience of seeing the projected hymns in a way that was really impressive to me. On one occasion, the hymns were, or at least one of the hymns was abominably slow. I don't know if it was a beginning organist or what, but it was a strangely slow tempo. But in the case of the Lutheran, of the Jewish synagogue, it was so fast that I really questioned how you could comprehend what you were singing at that speed. It seemed almost rote to me, but it was a new experience. My main complaint in those 14 congregations was that every hymn was sung just about the same way. The stanzas were all sung about the same way, and I really was expecting some change of tempo, volume, organ registration, a different variety of instruments, men's voices, women's voices, soloists, choir, a cappella, something to give some life and meaning to the congregational singing. It was largely absent from those, and I was disappointed in that. So, with your experience, what has been the plus and the minuses of congregational singing with your experience, either where you are now or history or something else? You want to volunteer any experiences? We have pastors and ministers of music, former students. And yes, please.
My family and I lived in Singapore for 3 years,
yes.
And so we went to a church whose name was Community of Praise Baptist Church.
Okay.
And they sang for a full hour before the preacher ever got up to preach.
Okay, yeah.
It was the first time I'd ever seen Baptists sing so long.
Oh,
And my children were early high school, junior high age.
yeah.
When we came back to the United States, we started visiting churches to join. We visited a church, I won't name it, you would know it. We were out of the building in 55 minutes, and my middle son looked at me and said, "Is this intermission?" I said, "No, we're done." He said,
yeah, right.
"That's it?" I said, "Yeah, welcome back to the United States."
Have any others had an international experience with hymn singing? Anyone? We lived in Germany for a few years, and the hymn singing there is not a great deal different than ours, except for obvious language and a little different style of hymns. But I was not overly impressed with most of the congregations and the vitality with which they sang them. Yes?
One more.
Please.
We visited Bali, and we discovered that our waitress was a member of St. Matthew's Methodist Church in Bali. So I went to church with her husband, and her husband was a teacher in the school. And when we got there, they were singing the hymns I knew. They were just singing them in Balinese, and I was singing them in English.
Yeah.
And we looked at each other, and it was this sort of ethereal moment when you think, this is what it's going to be like in heaven. You know, people were smiling and hugging, and it was one of those moments when you realize that hymns can transcend many things.
Absolutely, yeah, true. I taught liturgies for a while at the seminary, and in preparation for that, visited the liturgies of many different denominations. And in studying the liturgies, I was really impressed with most of them. They're beautiful acts of worship, and I really was inspired by the liturgy. But when I went to the churches to observe it, I didn't sense that people were quite caught up. It seemed kind of like a routine they went to, and I was so disappointed. It was a beautiful, meaningful liturgy, but it seemed to have lost. And I think that's happened too much with congregational singing of hymns. Well, I think there's some reasons for that. It's really difficult to know to what extent a hymn is spiritual, emotional, mental, physical. Those may look familiar to you. Jesus said to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and I think that is an act of worship in Him. There are some challenges to good hymn singing, and one of them is that hymns are sung. Well, that seems obvious, doesn't it? But when you sing a text, you're going to the tempo, rhythm, metrical accent of the music, and sometimes that enhances the text, sometimes it doesn't make it quite as clear as simply reading the text. But that is one thing that maybe keeps some people from really understanding the text. All they've ever done is sing it at the same rhythm and tempo. Also, hymns are sung by a congregation. Well, of course, that's what hymns are for. But and they're certainly not a choir. But congregations can be more choral than we allow them to be. They can be interpreted with singing if they have some help, I think. The hymns are interlined in the hymnal, and it makes it great for the music, but sometimes it completely destroys the poetry, the meaning of it. Hymns are strophic, same music to every stanza. That can be deadly, or it can be an opportunity for variety. And as I said before, hymns are a brief experience, 2.5 minutes to sing the whole hymn. Fortunately, some of those are repeated, but when they're repeated, sometimes they just become overly familiar and we cease to pay a lot of attention to them. So the problem is that I think hymns have been rarely explained to people to understand those 8 voices, and meaningful hymn singing has probably not been really demonstrated to a lot of people. So as I said, Jesus' words were with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And based on my weeks of observation, I have the strong feeling that singing of hymns could use considerable revitalization. I'll suggest a couple of things at the end and hope you will also suggest some. It's not so much that worshipers were not fully engaged mentally and spiritually, nor because they were unaware of these many voices or aspects of hymns. It was, for me, those of us who teach, plan, and lead hymn singing have really made little effort to make hymn singing meaningful. So we can spend more time in looking at each of these aspects of hymnody. I think this is on your outline, and I maintain that the biblical basis of a hymn is an indispensable center. A hymn cannot be contrary to Scripture and ought to have something supported with Scripture, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. The theological and liturgical aspects are the application of the biblical content of the hymn, the theological and liturgical, and we'll talk about liturgical in a moment. I want to go back to here. The literary and musical aspects are simply the medium of the media for which these theological and liturgical statements of the Bible are made. The historical and socio-cultural voices are the context, and we'll talk more about those in a moment. And then the functional, the actual performance of the hymn, that is where it comes to fruition. Is this outlined on your paper too? I think I included it because I am enamored with the interrelationship of all of these things. Each of the 8 voices has a direct relationship to the other 7. And it makes it a highly integrated polyphony of many voices. Well, let's talk about the biblical basis of a hymn. And these are for me, this is the theme of the polyphony. It's the most basic requirement. There are a lot of ways that a hymn can make use of the Bible. One is actual quotation of Scripture. Sometimes it's just a few key words, sometimes a phrase. But Daniel Little's gospel song, I Know Whom I Have Believed, is a quotation from 2 Timothy 1:12. It's a quote from the Bible. That's about as most obvious use of the Bible as you can make, I think. Sometimes there are mosaics of quotes. William Williams's Guide Me, O Thy Great Jehovah is a whole list of references, allusions to the Exodus. Also, Provincius' O Love of the Father's Love Begotten. That's another kind of mosaic of quotations. Another use of the hymns of versification, and that would be like Keith's All People on Earth, 212 from Psalm 100. Paraphrase, something like Watts's Jesus Shall Reign from Psalm 72. We could stop at this point and let the resident authority of Watts speak to us. David Music on the corner there has written and talked about Watts and published about Watts for many years. And his use of the Scripture is magnificent, very often versification, sometimes paraphrase. Allusion, sometimes just a word or a phrase. A lot of people who sing I'll Raise Mine Ebenezer didn't even know you could own one. It's amazing. And have no idea that it refers to 1 Samuel 7:12 and Samuel's experience there, but many people did not recognize that. Many people do not recognize it. The simple phrase, and with a look recall, that James Montgomery uses in The Hour of Trial, which is a reference to Luke's comment about during his trial, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Very moving, powerful moment, and its inclusion in that hymn is really very powerful, but I don't think most people have any idea where it comes from, where its basis. Okay, so a hymn, at least in my opinion, must be consistent with biblical teaching and show some signs of sound principles of hermeneutics. Rich, you'd agree with that, right? Yeah.
It helps.
You do that in preaching, I'm sure. Okay, good. Yeah. Okay. The theological voice in all of this, a hymn must be consistent with whatever the doctrine of the church is and with biblical theology. That is the whole branch of theology, Christology, and pneumatology, which of course is the Trinity, the God of Christ, and the Holy Spirit. Soteriology, dealing with the doctrine of salvation, that's the basic doctrine. Ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church. Theodicy, I want to say a bit about that in a moment, but that's the defense of an all-loving, all-powerful God, and still we have suffering and evil. I think that matter of theodicy is, for me, one of the most difficult aspects of Christian doctrine. It really is I have trouble thinking about eternity in the sense of never ending. I have even worse problems with trying to understand eternity is never beginning. I can't quite get my mind around that concept. It never began, it always was. And so there's some things in theology that are problematic. And I think hymns should address some of those areas. You can't answer them, but they need to be confronted and people need to teach them. So in this concept, they're dealing with the defense of God's goodness and omnipotence in light of suffering. There is, given the power of hymns, I think history shows that they are not only expressions of theology, they sometimes shape our theology, and some people's theological knowledge is based more on the hymns they sing in the Bible. Thank you, Amy. I may make it through. Yeah. So it's very serious when a hymn can be misleading. The fine hymn Beneath the Cross of Jesus originally was said, two wonders I confess, the wonders of his glorious love and my own worthlessness. And that's not sound theology. We're not worthless. Jesus died for us. But we are unworthy. And a better translation would be, a better version would be, the two wonders I confess, my unworthiness, I think even the hymn, even a great hymn like Yochanander's Praise to the Lord the Almighty, has a line, ponder anew what the Almighty can do if with his love he befriends you. They sang that last Sunday in church. I didn't sing that line. It's not a matter of if God befriends you. John 3:16 doesn't say God so loved the world. No, it's an affirmation. And a better, and factly the German is much more accurate than the translation. The German is more, he who with love doth befriend you. And the accent comes on the verb does. And so it's a big difference between if God decides to befriend you and between if he does. Another hymn that I think has theological problems is a really fine hymn. There is a wideness in God's mercy, which I really like. But I'm uncomfortable with the stanza that says, if our love were but more simple, we should take him at his word, and our lives would be all sunshine in the sweetness of our Lord. The little girls in hill country, life is not all sunshine. And our hymns need to confront those kinds of things. It's wrong for us to convey bad theology like that. And sometimes it's very subtle and it's a matter of a word or a prefix or something, but it makes a big difference. And if it lodges in some people's mind, it's unfortunate, yeah. Yeah, I was going to say on this matter of theodicy, Andrew Pratt, who was for many years editor of the Hymn Society of Great Britain and Ireland, confronted this issue and had a very fine article in their journal a few years ago about hymnody of theodicy. And he wrote two hymns that deal with this. Yeah, you can read that. One of the this is dealing back with Elijah's experience in 1 Kings 19. And Pratt says, what of the earthquake, wind, and fire? Not just the Seal's ball voice. What of the twister's wild lament and the cancer's choice? He also wrote, in every face we see the pain of grief and human loss, the hell we cannot understand, we cannot count the total cost. In each disaster we recount Earth's shifting, changing ways. Creation brings its agony, the challenge to our praise. And a hymn like that, I think, could maybe speak to a congregation in the hill country in these last few days and confront the issue. You don't answer it, but we must deal with those kinds of things. There are a lot of hymns that deal with this, but we need some current hymns and very specific hymns for a specific situation. And I think it would have been great if the minister of music or pastor on that Sunday following that event wrote a hymn expressly addressing that specific situation. Routley at one time spoke of a disposable hymnody, that there's sometimes a hymn that's written for an occasion, it's sung, it's meaningful, and you put it away, it's not appropriate anymore. But there is a place for some hymn that addresses specifically those areas. Anybody have any comments about that difficult area of theodicy or writing hymns for? Do any of you here write hymns? Some hymn writers? You write some, good. Yeah, David?
I just
Yeah,
wanted to
oh,
say,
yeah.
Carl Dahl said,
Yeah.
you know, after 9/11,
Uh-huh.
of course, he's a hymn writer, and so somebody asked him, you know, what hymns can we sing for that?
Yeah.
You know, on that thing. Well, he had just written one.
Yeah.
And he said, where did you find this?
Uh-huh.
And he said, well, I wrote it. I mean, it's like all hymns were from the 18th
Yeah,
century. So,
I have also been impressed with the church year, liturgical year, and the scriptures that are chosen years ahead of time. Sometimes it's amazing how appropriate those hymns are for an unusual historical event. I would like sometime to go back and look at some significant historical events, find what was happening with the scripture on that year, and then there's a way for perceptive pastors, I think, to capture that and see it, bring it to life. Yeah. Other comments of anybody writing a hymn or dealing with this matter of appropriateness? Okay, well, let's talk about the liturgical. In the Greek New Testament, liturgia refers to ministry, of a whole area of ministry, and is not a term of just the liturgy of one denomination. I like the term liturgical rather than ministry. Ministry has different concepts, but I think this deals with the whole function of the church, what a church is supposed to do. For me, I think everything that a church does or that a Christian does can somehow be grouped under one of these four headings. And it's kind of helpful to me to simplify and group these things, to think worship, discipleship, missions, evangelism, witnessing, and then service to the temple needs. I can't think of anything that I do as try to do as an individual Christian or the church does that doesn't some way fit under these four. We had sabbatic leave programs at the seminary in which every 7 years you're supposed to go away, study, refresh, reconsider things. And on my first sabbatic in 1974-5, I wrestled with these four things, and I think, well, I'm doing pretty good. Worship, private, family, corporate worship, doing fairly good. Discipleship, fairly well. Bible study and prayer, doing that. But missions, evangelism, and witnessing, I didn't run into a lot of lost people at the seminary. Probably were there, but and I didn't see very many lost people in the church I went to, and the church and the seminary were kind of my life, and I had to rethink how do you get to this. And also, I didn't deal with a lot of people who had needs of just basic life things, and that's when I became interested in international students, and I found working with them, I can begin to address these two things a little more appropriately than I used to. Okay. The literary hymns are poetic statements, and it is a poetry, it's a creative language that shapes diction or vocabulary, nomenclature, grammar, syntax, tone, voice, meter, rhythm, rhyme, tempo, movement, mood, rhetorical figures, rhythm, form, all of those things, a carefully written hymn text is shaping all of those kinds of things. And David, I think Timothy Dudley Smith worked with all of those kinds of aspects in his hymnody, and never was it obtrusive that you were seeing, hey, here's Adam Diprosis or his Mesovodipos. It was a natural flow of things, but it incorporated beautiful poetic language. And the interrelation of these, again, I'm still kind of enamored with this kind of interrelationship of things, but each of these 13 is related to the other 12, and when you deal with language with that detail, it brings a whole new dimension to hymnody. Well, the musical aspects, the musical properties of music and their most basic forms are pitch, duration, intensity, timbre, texture, form, and then style, which is the distinctive ways all of those things are used. They all have multiple subdivisions in there, but that's the basic thing. But to deal with all of those intelligently in writing a hymn tune, and David, you've done hymn tunes as well as text, it takes a real competent musician as David to write a hymn tune such as that.
Well, you haven't heard them.
I'm sorry?
I said you haven't heard them, so.
Well, I have, yeah. They're in print and I have played them, yeah. Yeah, good point. And again, that's the interrelationship of those 7 matters to each other. Okay, the historical biographical facet of a hymn is the context in which the hymn was written through time, and which has come down to us. Many people say it's completely immaterial to know anything about the composer if you look at the writer. T.S. Eliot, most slouch of the poet, said we understand the work better if we understand something of the poet's life. And I think that there are a lot of stories floating around about him. Some of them I think are apocryphal, but knowing a bit about the hymn writer, where it came from, can be very meaningful, I think. The socio-cultural is another aspect of the hymnody that's crucial, and it again involves multiple dimensions: geographical, ethnic character, geographical origin, ancestry, language, tradition, customs, religion, art, ideology, of the people who wrote the hymn. If you understand all of that, you begin to gain a great deal of insight into a hymn. But it's not only the people who wrote it, but it's the socio-cultural context of the people who sing the hymn today. Not sure about your congregation in Lampasas, but most congregations are more diverse socioculturally than we know. Sometimes there's a big difference between financial status, educational status, values, and all of that. And we face congregations sometimes very diverse, and it's kind of hard to know how to preach to them or select hymns for them. Benji Harlan spoke to me today. I remember one time he said that he chose music that could offend everybody. It applied to some and didn't to others. But, well, the last of these functions, the last of these voices is the functional, and this is where everything comes into play when you actually perform a hymn. And to perform it and keeping in mind all of those 8 things and all the subdivisions in them, it's impossible to do that, but I think we are under obligation to try to understand those somewhat better. I think it's worth going back to and being reminded of the biblical basis of all this whole thing we've been talking about. Jesus and his disciples sang a hymn at the Lord's Supper, technically a psalm, but a hymn text of the day. Paul and Silas sang hymns. Paul in his epistles encourages singing. He spoke of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. I have talked to some people who feel like those are three synonyms. I don't think so at all. I think they're clearly three different forms of writing that are very different in Paul's day and very different in our day, and I think they're all vital. Portions of the New Testament are considered hymn like the Magnificat, the Benedictus, the Immatus, Philippians 2, Colossians 3:15, Ephesians 5:19. All of those are basically hymn text. Greek scholars seem to think they have poetic dimensions and something of them may have actually been sung. Okay. Not only in the New Testament, but the roots of the New Testament also speak of hymns, and so the whole book of Psalms is a hymnal. The Song of Moses, Song of Miriam, Song of Deborah, large sections of the prophets. I'm working with a student now who's majoring in Hebrew language and studying specifically a number of the prophets, especially Zechariah, and it's fascinating how much of those books are actually poetry of the time. It was an emphatic language to be used. And other than the Bible itself, hymns are still the most basic form of Christian literature. Every denomination practically has its own hymnal, its collection of hymns that are biblical, theological, liturgical, that address their situations. Well, if it is in a situation that I think can be improved, what are they? I hope you're thinking about this and can share with me in a moment, how do we improve this experience and make it a little bit more where it does speak to all of those voices that we've been identifying. For me, one thing is that congregations should have opportunity to hear the choir sing hymns. There's something simply to listening to a hymn rather than trying to sing it. And if a choir can sing a hymn interpretively, beautifully, a congregation can't match that, but they can begin to understand the importance of really trying to understand mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically what's involved in hymn singing. So I think one thing is simply really demonstrating on certain selected verses that the choir sings it. I have a lay friend who's very opposed to making the verses different each time. I don't know why it upsets him, but he's very intent on not having the men sing this. And sometimes it's gimmicky for the women to sing this and the men on the third verse, you know. But we're talking about a meaningful kind of timbre which enhances the text. Yes, please.
When you say the choir sing, which way do you usually do? Unison or in parts?
I think you can do both effectively. The next thing I have on here is the soloist, simply hearing a good soloist.
Yeah.
Few people in the congregation are soloists, but when you hear a soloist really interpret a hymn, you think, I've never thought of that meaning. You see things, hear things in it. So a unison singing of the choir is fine. If they can do it well in harmony, that's an added dimension.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you answered the question, because I think sometimes when choir sings in four parts,
Yeah.
you know, people are drawn to their harmony,
Yeah.
and then they don't.
Oh, yeah, okay.
They don't
It
hear
can be
the
distracting.
words.
Yeah.
So unison, or
Mhm.
when you said solo,
Soloist, yeah.
I think especially a solo, if
Yeah.
interpreted
Yeah.
the thing,
Right.
it can be very, very effective,
Yeah.
touching.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been listening some recently to Fischer Dieskau sing some Schubert songs, and what an interpretive singer he was. And also, it's interesting to know Schubert wrote hundreds and hundreds of songs, and many of them strophic, but he made a difference in the strophes. They were written differently. Yeah, I've heard a story, probably apocryphal, about an organist playing for AGO certification, and Part of the testing was somebody suggested to her, would you improvise a bit for us on the Nettleton tune? And her question was, what hymn text? And they suggested a hymn text, and then she said, what stanza? That's an organist. Yeah, yeah. It makes a big difference between the first and third verse of some hymns, and to hear it done well brings it to life, and I think it's really, really crucial, yeah. So, the choir or the solo voice, those are important things. And I think it's important that congregations, worshipers begin to understand how the organist and the pianist or whatever instruments, how much they contribute to the service and what they're doing in interpreting the hymn text. Well, simply the opportunities to hear those things and be aware of them is a major step in my way of thinking about improving congregational singing. A second thing for me is the pre-service introduction and rehearsal. I have a strong aversion to hymn services, to worship services beginning with announcements. I don't think that's the place for announcements. I think that comes at the end when people leave the church. It's very distracting for me to go in, and I don't like to be welcome. Welcome, we're glad. No, I'm not here for you. I came for a different reason. I don't need to be welcomed. You don't need to announce what's happening in the church. Let's get to the point here. And a pre-service introduction can be a way to really set the tone for the service, to explain what we're doing, and maybe to even rehearse the hymn and read it and see what's happening. 3 to 5 minutes spent that way sometimes can completely revolutionize a worship experience. I worked with a pastor in the second church I was in, First Baptist Church in Kingsville, a very creative man and a fine soloist, much better soloist than I was. He was a fine singer and a creative person in the worship service. And sometimes we designed the service and he walked to the pulpit, or didn't walk to the pulpit. He would just walk out and begin preaching. Yeah. And sometimes he would just sit down in a chair and he was Matthew or he was Luke. An impressive kind of beginning to a service, just captured you. And then the hymns that followed that were more meaningful, realizing the context of what happened. So sometimes creative worship planning, as well as these things, can be pretty meaningful and do something to enhance congregational singing. Have any of you ever done any of these kind of pre-service introductions or rehearsals of a hymn before the service? Bruce, you have done some? Yeah, good. Bruce Leafblad, that used to teach at Southwestern, used to do that with the seminary people, and I enjoyed it. Some people thought, oh, here we go again with another lecture. Oh, no, it was short and to the point, but I appreciated that kind of thing, yeah. But what do you suggest as to how we might improve congregational singing, other than what I... Yes, please, Chris.
Dr. Gray, I was thinking about the demonstration of meaningful hymn singing. One thing that struck me was, gee, I wish everybody could go to 14 different worship services for a few weeks and just be exposed to all that. Two things that right now we're doing right in our church is that we've got a worship planning team. So that it's not just one person or two selecting the music.
Yes.
And that brings in multiple voices.
Yeah.
And then our whole team is here for this conference.
Oh, good, yeah.
Being able to come and be able to participate in it, see, and it just challenges us. We go back and we think, gee, what, how can we do this or that?
Yeah. That's good. At the seminary, I taught the introduction to church music course, which the theology students were required to take and never really cared for it much. But I really recommended to every class I taught for the introduction to theology students, form a worship committee. And do it an ad hoc committee, 4 or 5 weeks, they meet once a week. And the first week, you talk about biblical worship and what worship really is and what goes into it. Then let them begin to suggest things that fit that pattern, and suggest hymns and things maybe we don't do. Then they go back into the congregation with a different concept of worship. A new team comes in and it becomes a cycle. So that can be a really influential thing. Yeah, good point, yeah. Yes, please.
I think that taking your choir with you on the journey and teaching them that they're part of the leadership,
Yes,
and if they model the importance of hymn singing and they have a sense of joy about what they're doing, then they can help the congregation, and I think the congregation will enjoy it if people that they're watching are enjoying it on the platform. And I tell them not to, once you get up there, quit worrying about it. Just enjoy worship and sing.
Yeah.
And we had the choir sing descants and lead in different ways and do different things so that they are modeling for the congregation.
right, good.
And they help the congregation and take the congregation, because the people who are the professional singers, we sing well, and the average person in the pew says, I can't sing as well as that person.
Right.
But if they see the people in the choir who they know from
Exactly.
from being in Sunday school with them and being in different
Yeah.
places, then they're more apt to be part of that.
I think you're right, yeah. The church I belong to and go to mostly is, I have several people, former students in the choir. I find myself looking at them when the singing, and I'm always impressed that they are involved in this. I'm kind of enamored in I've been watching some opera lately, and there's a scene from Donizetti's Lucia dell'Amore, the sextet and all. The way it was staged, there were probably 150 people on the stage and the major 6 characters and all that. I find myself looking at that person on the 3rd row in the back, and they're professional, they're involved, and that's what we want to see in our choirs, I think, yeah. Other suggestions? We're about out of time.
Dr. Gray,
Yes, please.
one thing I think that would help our hymn singing is if the leaders quit taking it for granted. How much time do we spend in a choir rehearsal with our choir? Maybe have an hour rehearsal a week. How much time do you spend even choosing the hymns?
Yeah,
5 minutes?
yeah.
Much less how you're going to sing them and how you're going to approach them. And, I think until we start giving attention as leaders to it, then it's not going to get better.
Yeah, and share with them what's involved in selecting the hymns and choosing them, what were your decisions about this. And also working with the pastor, I think, is really crucial. You can feed a pastor a lot of information about hymns that he can use and begin to create a sensitivity to hymns and listening to them meaningfully. Yeah, a pastor may be more effective than the minister of music sometimes in suggesting those kind of things, yeah.
Yeah, they expect it from you, they don't expect it from him.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I actually go to choir practice in our congregation and sing in the choir.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah.
I tell people that's the only place in the church I get to sit on the back row and cause trouble.
Yeah. I was interim minister of music at a Lutheran church for exact church year, from the first ended to the end, yeah. And for every rehearsal, the pastor rehearsed with us, and the choir was in the back of the sanctuary, and when it came time for the choir, he came back, sang with us, and that made all the difference in the world about how people approach the hymn singing, yeah. Our time is about gone. I thank you for coming and listening to my raspy voice and weird ideas, and I hope to have opportunity to visit with you more. Thank you.